Okay, thank you for inviting us to give an overview of the limited partnership regime that was launched last year in Hong Kong. So to start, I guess it would be helpful if we can talk a bit about Hong Kong's overall situation in terms of fund management and in terms of capital flows. Now, but as most of the information has been covered in the keynote speech by our Undersecretary, I will just mention one point here, which is the continuous and consistent growth in terms of our private equity and venture capital AUM over the past many years in Hong Kong. So if you look at this chart, Joseph earlier mentioned that we are second largest in Asia in terms of managing private equity and venture capital AUM. Now, this gives you a sense as how Hong Kong has been doing. We're number 2 following mainland China. We are well ahead of number 3 and others in the league table. And all these are from market information by independent sources. In terms of fund managers in the space, we are also doing very great. We right now have more than 560 investment managers in the space of private equity and venture capital. This is very encouraging, and a good point to note is that, as I said earlier, this trend is going upward. Now, despite the challenges we faced over the past 2 years in terms of the social unrest and in terms of COVID, we are still seeing more people coming, more capital coming into Hong Kong to play. So this LPF project actually started about 4 years ago. When we looked at the situation, we in the government, in the Kong Monetary Authority, we did not want to be complacent. So when we looked at how market practitioners were doing, we noticed what we now refer to as an offshore operation model, which I would say back then, and even as of now, more than 90% of players in this field operate under. Now, by offshore business model, we refer to as having CMC center management of control outside of Hong Kong. We also refer to as the fund vehicle itself. So the triangle in the middle part of this slide being an offshore domiciled fund vehicle. The most common vehicle that we're seeing for private equity and venture capital would be the Cayman Islands domiciled exempted limited partnership, or ELP, so to speak. As I said, many funds in Asia adopt this model, and this actually comes with a number of costs. Setup costs in terms of money, how much money you pay to the offshore jurisdiction related service providers, lawyers, auditors, etc. And also the costs in terms of time and operational smoothness or hiccups that you're prepared to take by using this model. Now, for instance, many people using this model would have to go outside of Hong Kong for certain business activities. Now, for instance, they may have to host investors meetings or directors meeting outside Hong Kong. They may have to do something else in order to preserve their tax position, as well as to preserve their legal position to do things properly. And this model has proven to be a little bit challenging during the current state of the world, which is basically minimal travel state. And indeed, a couple of years back, when we looked at this model, we saw a number of evolving trends unfolding in the international arena that actually puts some threats to this model. Number one, and being the most important one or most relevant to fund managers, it's the tax development and the OECD, the Organization for Economic Development. This project is known as the Base Erosion and Profit Shifting Project, or the BEPS project. Now, this started a number of years back, about a decade ago, where at the beginning only the G20 governments were advocating this, and then eventually about 70 jurisdictions ratified to this BAPS agreement many years back when we started looking at this LPF project. And now I would say that more than 100 governments have ratified, including Hong Kong. For instance, we have already enacted legislation in respect of BAPS projects. So what does this mean? BAPS in a layman language started off with a hope to tackle funny tax structures, creative tax structures, normally taken by multinational corporates or MNCs in order to avoid legitimately their tax exposure or tax risk. So eventually this spilled over to the fund management industry, which I would personally think that at the outset of BAPS 1.0, it might not be the original intent of the initiative. But right now, as we see from it, the implication that is quite familiar with many of the industry practitioners, to give you some example, is the blacklisting of Cayman Islands by the European Union last year, and also which led to a number of economic substance or ES tightening in the relevant offshore jurisdictions. Industry practitioners might have heard about the additional requirements since about 2 years ago for offshore funds to have local hires in offshore jurisdictions, which they themselves may have only 50,000 population to offer. Then a fund having domiciled there may have to recruit 2 full-time investment professionals paid and living in that jurisdiction. Now that's one challenge, obviously. The other thing that we noted from last year's change was that a number of jurisdictions have introduced new laws, for instance, the private funds law, such that new offshore funds set up under that particular jurisdiction would have to subscribe to, would have to be registered under that new legislation. And this means, to the minimum, a few additional $1,000 of registration fees, as well as some onerous requirements in terms of audit. You may have to appoint offshore, additional offshore layer of auditors to sign off your audited accounts. And then you may have to appoint you may have to adopt additional valuation criteria, which is compliant with that particular jurisdiction's requirements. So all of these have haunted a number of industry practitioners, and this was what happened last year. So going back a few years more, we saw AIFMD happening in Europe. So AIFMD means the Alternative Investment Managers Fund Directive, AIFMD. And essentially that's catalyzed the onshoring of funds into Europe because of regulatory considerations and because of the incentives given to fund managers who are ready to set up in Europe locally, that they will be entitled to what we call a fund passport scheme. So if you qualify in being operating onshore and having a proper license in one of the European Union jurisdictions, then you can sell the funds across Europe. So that's gave the industry a lot of incentive to onshore in Europe. Just a little bit of sidetrack. So before working on this LPF project, I myself was part of the exchange fund investment team, where I looked after the Europe private equity and real estate portfolio. Now back then, when we talked to European fund managers, and we're talking about 5-6 years ago, we talk with our peer investors about investments in the Europe fund. After discussion of the investment thesis, it would be very likely that one of the questions to follow from the peer investor would be that, hey Anson, what's the investment vehicle that you are planning to go into for this investment? Now, if it's an offshore vehicle, i.e., folks like Cayman Islands, BVI, Jersey Guernsey, it would be very likely that we could not carry forward the discussion, because back then there was a very clear drive and consensus among the serious money guys that they want to avoid offshore structures. And a few years after, which is now, when we revisit the notion with European counterparts, what we see is that this trend has cascaded down, obviously, from the largest institutions to the mid-caps and to the commercial operating businesses, investors, because they do want to give a very good impression to the local tax authority that they are not affiliated with any of these jurisdictions that may give them a bad reputation of trying to do something funny behind the tax authorities. So this is an unfolding trend. And right now, when we talk to Asian investors, particularly those from the mainland, we are seeing a similar trend evolving now. So what happened in Europe 5-6 years ago is now happening in the mainland, and we're seeing this coming in full swing. In terms of impact, it's probably a little bit early to say, but personally, I think that it's more prudent for funds to seriously consider domiciling in a local jurisdiction which offers business substance than in the traditional offshore model. So the third is the cost consideration. As mentioned earlier, the blacklisting of certain jurisdictions have led to operational hiccups of a lot of funds, and that's why we started a couple of years back to try to map out a strategy for Hong Kong. And this blueprint comprises of 3 building blocks. Now, to start with, our position is that Hong Kong has been operating as a robust private equity and venture capital hub for many years. If we do nothing, then chances are that when BAPS comes, when the Asia version of a regulatory trend, such as that in AIFMD comes, then the industry on the ground may have no choice but to consider leaving Hong Kong. Now, this is the last thing we wanted to see. And that's why in our blueprint, we make it very clear as a policy priority to make sure that what we are doing is to offer the industry an alternative solution to tackle all that they are going to face. Now, the first thing we did was a fund level tax exemption. As Grace mentioned earlier in her presentation, this is effectively broadening the scope of the original tax exemption in Hong Kong, which at the time only applied to offshore funds. Now with this, we make it equally applicable to onshore funds, i.e. LPFs or OFCs. And also with this broadening of scope, along the way, we also relaxed the requirements under this regime that fund managers need to comply with. That's the first building block, and it was enacted 2 years ago in 2019. The second building block for PE and VC was the Limited Partnership Fund Ordinance. Now, before that, Hong Kong had its Limited Partnership Ordinance, and that is more than a century old, clearly enacted before evolution of the private equity industry in the States in the mid-60s. Now, this new ordinance, which came into effect last August, 31st of August last year, has attracted a lot of industry discussion and a lot of new users to test this out. We'll talk about this a bit later. The third building block is a carry interest tax regime, which was again enacted this year. And this is to give fund managers a strong incentive to use Hong Kong as their operating center by giving them a full tax exemption on their carry interest, which is the performance equity and venture capital. So what is LPF? LPF is essentially very similar to ELP, Cayman Limited Partnership. or other limited partnership in relevant jurisdictions. For instance, the state of Delaware in the US, the Luxembourg vehicle, we are very similar to what's already in the market. So in a nutshell, I've listed here the details to set up the requirements for setting up an LPF. I'm not going to go through it point by point, but in essence, what you need is a GP, general partner, and at least one limited partner, LP. So the GP essentially is the legal person representing the limited partnership fund. The LP is the investor. So you need one operator, one investor to set up. And this slide has listed the various forms of entities allowed under the ordinance to become the GP and LP respectively. So you note that it essentially covers all realistic permutations of what a GP could be and LP could be in a typical limited partnership structure out there. So under the LPF ordinance, we also require that GP appoints an investment manager, which can be itself, to operate the day-to-day investments of the LPF. Now this chart, I give a few examples of what investments can be made under an LPF. But I would like to point out that under the LPF ordinance, we have made it quite conscious not to impose any investment restrictions. So what we see on this slide is actually a few examples of what asset classes you can invest under LPF. The right-hand side bottom corner box, I've highlighted a couple of points surrounding the operation of LPF. Now, when we designed this regime, we thought we would like to offer an alternative to fund managers using LPF as master funds or as a project funds, similar to the structure in this chart here. When we started really drafting the legislation, which I took part in the drafting committee, and then from time to time we discuss with the Department of Justice to instill maximum amount of flexibility in the vehicle. We actually make reference to 7 jurisdictions laws when we map out the details of the LPF ordinance, including, as I said, Cayman Islands, Luxembourg, State of Delaware, United Kingdom, Australia, Singapore, and Ireland. So you notice that all major fund centers have been made reference to, and what we did essentially is to make our regime better than any of those if we were to be compared with them one-on-one. So after the rollout of the regime, we noticed that this regime not only worked for traditional master fund and project fund, but also we can use it as a feeder fund or a project co-investment vehicle under a typical fund structure. And also, right now, I also noticed that some family offices are actively pursuing this. Some use it as an asset holding or inheritance planning, intergenerational planning of wealth transformation vehicle, that type of vehicle. Recently, we have also worked with some virtual assets investment managers to promote the use of limited partnership fund in the context of tokenization and in the context of real estate development. So we're very excited about this. In terms of take-up, this regime was launched on the 31st of August last year. As of the 31st of August this year, so 1 year, we have got 332 limited partnership vehicles registered. Users, as I said, spent across different spaces, PEVC being the largest category of users. And we talked about family offices, virtual assets, special situation funds, and another chunk of major users will be late-stage pre-IPO investors. That we noticed that investor clubs may form together a limited partnership fund and bid for a pre-IPO deal. We see that quite a lot. Another type of major user would be hedge funds. Now, I will be very frank. When we designed or when we wrote the legislation, I myself was not, targeting the hedge fund community. But I say that the collective wisdom of the group, of the drafting group, has made the legislation so flexible that after it's rolled out, a number of hedge fund groups approached us and say that, hey, we can actually use this as our investment vehicle. And I said, oh, welcome. And then we carry on the discussion. So a number of those vehicles have been set up already. So I'll say that the LPF is a truly flexible domicile vehicle for Hong Kong. Now, master fund managers that we've met with that have used the LPF vehicle, we noticed that a large number of them are mainland related. So either they raise capital from the mainland or they invest in the mainland market. Now, this is very natural. Particularly, remember last time when we started, last year, when we started promoting this regime, we couldn't really travel anywhere. So all we did is, my team did 70-ish webinars and, more than 100 one-on-one meetings with GPs, investors, etc. And some of these webinars cover the mainland, but because of time zone and everything, we find it really hard for us to really outreach to the region and internationally to the Western world, so to speak. So naturally, it would be, the take-up would be mainly from mainland-related investment managers. And the next biggest group, local investment managers. Now, some use this vehicle because of cost considerations, and some because of investor preferences, which we can also talk about briefly afterwards. But we also see a number of global names, the fund manager in the top 20 league table of the world. They have also used a few of the limited partnership vehicle as a test for their, for ongoing adoption of the project, of the regime. So we try to understand why these fund managers would like to test LPF. Now, a lot of them is because of cost consideration. Some tell me that the cost saving by using LPF as compared to using a traditional onshore offshore vehicle would be, LPF would cost them about 1/7 to 1/20 of what they otherwise would have to spend on an offshore vehicle maintenance. The other major reason for using LPF is that fund managers consider it much more likely for them to enjoy Hong Kong's double taxation agreement network by using LPF as compared to operating offshore. Now, this in turn would mean that their investments, for instance, in mainland China, will save a few percentage points at least of tax money, giving a boom to their base case IRR. Now, this is to mention Hong Kong's tax treaty network. We now cover about 90% of the jurisdictions in APAC where PE and venture capital deals are struck every year by industry data. So the other reasons, as I mentioned, the unfolding trends in Europe and Asia. So if fund managers are eyeing on the overseas market or mainland market, then definitely they want to raise funds, they want to grow. They would prefer a domicile which is more likely to survive all the challenges by the international tax and regulatory community standards. Key features of LPF, I just want to highlight one point, which is a straightforward registration under the LPF regime. So all we need is that you submit to the company's registry. So not the HKMA, not SFC. You submit to the CR a list of hard facts about your fund. For instance, the name of your fund, the name of the GP, the name of the investment manager, and a high-level description of your investment strategy, which could be as simple as investing in private equity or venture capital in Asia with a view to profit, as simple as that. And of course, by using this regime, you need to have a correspondent address in Hong Kong. That's really for ongoing communication purposes. So for safe harbor rule, this offers a robust protection for investors' limited liability. So if an investor commit to an LPF saying that, well, I'm going to commit 10 million US dollars in this LPF, then we very much want to offer a clear protection of his limited liability to that 10 million US dollars. In other words, so long as he does not take part in the management of the investments, he should be well protected. His liability should be well protected and confined to what his commitment is. Now, in order to provide a clear safe harbor protection, we have indeed whitelisted a non-exclusive list in the legislation saying that, well, by conducting these activities, you are safe, right? You won't be taken as taking part in the management of the fund. So this is our way of providing a robust protection to investors. Flexible contractual freedom. So we have in the legislation modeled on the US and other jurisdictions to offer the best-in-class freedom contract. Now, this I'm not going to go through in detail, but I'll leave this for the audience because this essentially compares Hong Kong's regime in terms of cost, in terms of operational requirements, as a typical offshore structure. So notice that we are a lot cheaper, a lot more easier. This part covers tax, the fund level tax exemption, and also a high level description of the carry interest regime, which I'll leave to the tax experts we have in the room to go through. And one last point of my presentation is that just like the OFC, we are in the process of enacting for an amendment to allow redomiciliation. So hopefully our working target is that after 1st of November this year, we'll be able to allow limited partnerships domiciled offshore, for instance, in the Cayman Islands, to move into Hong Kong seamlessly after filling the form registration process. Again, very similar to the LPF outset registration. We provide certainty in terms of no stamp duty, in terms of the simple registration, and we welcome further inquiry and discussion. So I'll leave my contact here. We are the market outreach team of HKMA, so we meet with investors and fund managers on a day-to-day basis to explain what we do and to help them out in terms of moving their money, their people to Hong Kong. So feel free to connect through email, LinkedIn, or other means. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anson. Thank you very much. Very positive information to us.